Before forensic science, before fingerprints, before DNA, there were murders that left behind nothing but blood-stained floors, frightened witnesses, and questions that have survived for centuries. In lonely frontier cabins, fog-covered city streets, isolated islands, and forgotten country estates, killers appeared from the darkness, committed unthinkable crimes, and vanished without a trace. Entire communities lived in fear, convinced that whoever or whatever had committed these murders could strike again at any moment. Tonight on Black 13, we reopen 6 of history's most chilling unsolved homicide cases from the 18th and 19th centuries. We'll examine the evidence, the suspects, the haunting folklore, and the mysteries that investigators could never fully explain. So lock your doors, dim the lights, and step back into a world where justice was uncertain, the wilderness was unforgiving, and some killers disappeared into history, leaving behind only silence. Victorian England was a world obsessed with appearances. Behind the polished stone facades of elegant country homes lay strict family hierarchies, buried resentments, and secrets rarely spoken aloud. Respectability was everything. Yet on the night of June 29th, 1860, inside the quiet village of Road in Wiltshire, that carefully constructed image shattered forever. Before dawn, one child would vanish from his bed without a sound, and one of the most haunting murder mysteries in British history would begin. More than a century and a half later, investigators and historians still debate what truly happened inside Road Hill House. Was the killer a stranger who slipped unseen through the darkness? Or did the murderer already sleep beneath the same roof? Road Hill House was large enough to feel almost like a maze. Multiple staircases connected the floors. Long corridors disappeared into shadow after sunset. Servants occupied one section of the house while the Kent family lived in another, creating a complicated household where people often moved about without seeing one another. On that warm summer evening, everyone followed their usual routines. Lamps were extinguished one by one. Doors were secured. Children were tucked into bed. The family believed they were safe within their own home. Yet sometime during the night, someone entered the nursery, lifted 3-year-old Francis Saville Kent from his bed, and carried him silently through the sleeping house. How could a child be removed from a room without waking the family? More importantly, how could the killer navigate such a complicated home with such confidence? As daylight broke, panic swept through the household. The boy was gone. Servants searched every room while family members called his name through the halls and gardens. At first, hope remained that he had wandered away or hidden somewhere within the sprawling property. Then came the discovery no one could have imagined. The child's body was found inside an outdoor privy, concealed beneath debris. The crime shocked Victorian Britain, not only because of its brutality, but because it violated one of society's deepest assumptions, that the family home was a place of safety. Suddenly, every locked bedroom door and quiet country estate seemed capable of hiding unimaginable darkness. The local investigation quickly descended into confusion. Detectives examined doors, windows, footprints, and household routines, searching for evidence that might identify an intruder. Yet signs of forced entry were notably absent. Nothing appeared stolen. There was no clear indication that a stranger had broken into the house. Suspicion slowly turned inward. Every member of the household became a potential suspect. Family relationships were scrutinized. Servants whispered about private arguments. Long-buried tensions surfaced under relentless questioning. If the murderer had not entered from outside, did that mean the killer had been sitting at the family's dinner table only hours earlier? The case soon attracted one of Britain's earliest and most celebrated detectives, Jonathan Witcher of Scotland Yard. At a time when professional detectives were still viewed with suspicion, Witcher approached the crime differently. Rather than focusing on outsiders, he carefully studied the dynamics within the Kent family itself. His attention eventually settled upon 16-year-old Constance Kent, the victim's half-sister, which are believed she possessed both opportunity and motive. His conclusions shocked the public. Victorian society struggled to accept the possibility that a young woman from a respectable household could commit such a crime. Critics attacked the detective, newspapers questioned his methods, and public opinion turned sharply against him. Had Wisher uncovered an uncomfortable truth, or had he accused the wrong person based on circumstantial evidence? Years passed before the mystery took another dramatic turn. In 1865, Constance Kent unexpectedly confessed to the murder. She stated that she alone had killed her younger half-brother and accepted responsibility for the crime. Yet instead of ending the mystery, the confession created entirely new questions. Why confess 5 years later? Had guilt finally become unbearable? Or had she been protecting someone else all along? Even today, historians remain divided. Some accept her confession as genuine. Others argue that important aspects of the case remain unexplained, suggesting that the full story may never have been revealed. Did Constance truly act alone, or was her confession only one chapter in a much larger secret? What makes the Road Hill House murder so haunting is not merely the crime itself, but the atmosphere surrounding it. Imagine the silence that filled those hallways after the discovery. Every creaking floorboard would have carried suspicion. Every glance exchanged between family members might have concealed fear, grief, or hidden knowledge. The very architecture of the house seemed to encourage uncertainty, with staircases and corridors allowing movement through darkness without detection. In many ways, the building became another character in the mystery, a silent witness that could never testify. The Road Hill House murder transformed criminal investigation in Britain. It demonstrated that evil did not always arrive from distant forests or shadowed alleyways. Sometimes it emerged from within the family itself, hidden beneath ordinary routines and respectable appearances. It also helped shape the future of detective fiction, inspiring writers who would later create some of literature's greatest fictional investigators. Yet despite its influence on history, the emotional heart of the case remains unchanged. A child taken from his bed, a household forever shattered, and a question that continues to echo through the generations. Today, Road Hill House still stands, outwardly peaceful beneath the English sky. Visitors see a beautiful country home surrounded by quiet fields and ancient trees. Few would guess that within those walls unfolded one of the 19th century's most chilling murder mysteries. Whether Constance Kent told the complete truth, or whether parts of the story disappeared with those who lived it, one unsettling thought remains. On that summer night in 1860, someone walked silently through a sleeping house, committed an unthinkable act, and left behind a mystery that history has never been able to fully lay to rest. Sometimes the most terrifying crimes are not those committed in the wilderness, but those committed in the place we believe is safest of all. The American frontier promised opportunity, but it also concealed countless dangers beyond the reach of law. In the early 1870s, Kansas was still a land of lonely wagon trails, isolated homesteads, and endless prairie stretching toward the horizon. Travelers heading west often rode for days without seeing another settlement, relying on small inns and family farms for food, water, and a safe place to sleep. Hospitality was not simply a kindness, it was a necessity for survival. But along one lonely stretch of the Osage Trail stood a modest cabin, where weary travelers were always welcomed with a warm meal and a friendly smile. For many, it would become the last place they were ever seen alive. The family who operated the inn became known as the Bloody Benders. John Bender, his wife Elvira, their son John Jr., and their daughter Kate appeared ordinary enough to passing strangers. Kate, in particular, developed a reputation as a charismatic healer and spiritualist, claiming she could communicate with the dead and offer guidance to those seeking hope on the harsh frontier. Visitors often gathered to hear her lectures or receive private consultations. In a world where disease, loneliness, and uncertainty were constant companions, many people wanted to believe her. But was the family's kindness genuine? Or was every welcoming smile part of something far more sinister? As the months passed, an unsettling pattern began to emerge. Travellers entered Labette County carrying money, livestock, or supplies, but some never reached the next settlement. At first, few people noticed. The frontier was dangerous, and disappearances were not uncommon. Accidents happened. Storms swept across the plains. Outlaws roamed isolated roads. A missing traveller rarely triggered immediate alarm. Yet as the list of vanished people slowly grew longer, whispers began spreading between neighbouring towns. How could so many individuals disappear along the same stretch of road without leaving behind abandoned wagons, broken equipment, or any clear sign of what had happened? Eventually, concern became impossible to ignore. Local communities organised search parties to retrace the routes of missing travellers. Riders questioned settlers, examined abandoned campsites, and searched creek beds and wooded ravines. Every investigation ended in frustration. It seemed as though the prairie itself had swallowed these people whole. Then suspicion began falling upon the Bender homestead. Neighbours recalled that many of the missing had last been seen stopping there for a meal or a night's rest. Could an ordinary frontier family truly be connected to so many disappearances? Or were frightened settlers allowing coincidence to cloud their judgment? When authorities finally searched the property in 1873, they discovered the cabin abandoned. The Bender family had vanished without warning, leaving behind livestock, household possessions, and signs of a hurried departure. What investigators uncovered next transformed local suspicion into one of America's darkest frontier legends. Buried in shallow graves around the property were the remains of numerous victims. Historical estimates vary, but at least a dozen bodies were recovered, though some believe the true number may have been higher. Many appear to have suffered fatal head injuries before being buried in the orchard. The peaceful homestead had concealed a horrifying secret beneath its soil. Investigators attempted to reconstruct what they believed had happened inside the cabin. According to the prevailing theory, guests were seated with their backs to a heavy canvas curtain dividing the room. While distracted during conversation, they may have been struck from behind before their valuables were taken. The exact sequence of events remains uncertain, and some details have become intertwined with later retellings, making it difficult to separate documented evidence from frontier folklore. Yet the image itself is deeply unsettling. Imagine sitting down to supper after days of difficult travel, grateful for warmth and shelter, never realizing that every detail of the room had allegedly been arranged with deadly intent. The greatest mystery, however, began after the bodies were found. The bloody Benders themselves had disappeared. Poses formed across Kansas and neighboring states. Rewards were offered. Countless sightings poured in from frightened citizens convinced they had seen one or more members of the family. Some claimed they fled south into Indian Territory. Others believed they changed their names and blended into distant communities. Several suspects were arrested over the years, yet no prosecution ever conclusively identified the Benders or proved their fate. Did they escape justice entirely? Were they killed while fleeing? Or did they quietly begin new lives under different identities while the legend they left behind continued to grow? As decades passed, the Bender story evolved into one of the American frontier's most enduring legends. Some details are firmly supported by historical records: the discovery of the graves, the abandoned inn, and the widespread investigation. Other elements have become embellished through retelling, adding layers of folklore to an already disturbing true story. This blend of fact and legend is precisely what gives the case its lasting power. Every generation revisits the evidence, hoping to uncover the truth hidden beneath years of rumour and speculation. Yet the prairie offers few answers. Wind erases tracks, time silences witnesses, and history often leaves only fragments behind. Today, little remains of the lonely inn that once stood along the Osage Trail. The fields have grown quiet again, and the wagon traffic has long since disappeared. But the story of the Bloody Benders endures because it strikes at one of humanity's oldest fears, the fear of placing your trust in the wrong people. Somewhere in the fading light of the frontier, a traveller accepted an invitation to share a meal, believing they had found safety after a long journey. Instead, they stepped into one of the darkest mysteries of the American West. And perhaps the most chilling question of all is this: if the Benders truly escaped into the endless frontier, how many people spent years living beside them, never realizing who their neighbors really were? London in the winter of 1811 was a city suspended between progress and darkness. By day, the docks along the River Thames bustled with sailors, merchants, and labourers unloading cargo from every corner of the world. By night, however, the narrow streets east of the Tower of London became a maze of thick fog, flickering oil lamps, and deep shadows where even experienced constables hesitated to patrol alone. Ratcliff Highway was one of the busiest roads leading to the docks, crowded with boarding houses, taverns, and small shops serving thousands of seafarers. It was also a place where rumours spread quickly, fear travelled faster than reason, and death could arrive without warning. In December of that year, a series of murders would terrify the city so completely that many believed a monster walked the streets disguised as an ordinary man. The nightmare began on the evening of December 7th. Timothy Marr, a successful draper, had closed his shop for the night and settled inside with his wife Celia, their infant son, and a young apprentice. Nothing appeared unusual. Business had been good, the doors were secured, and the family expected another ordinary night. Yet sometime after darkness fell, someone entered the building. By morning, neighbours discovered a scene so horrifying that newspapers across Britain struggled to describe it. Timothy, his wife, the apprentice, and the infant child had all been killed inside the shop. The violence shocked even hardened investigators. There were signs of robbery, but the brutality seemed to exceed any simple theft. Why destroy an entire family? Why leave no witnesses behind? The city reacted with panic unlike anything seen in years. Word spread through taverns, marketplaces, and dockyards that a murderer was stalking the East End. Shopkeepers armed themselves before closing each evening. Families barricaded doors and slept with loaded pistols beside their beds. Patrols of frightened citizens began walking the streets after sunset, convinced the killer would strike again. London had witnessed violent crime before, but something about these murders felt different. They appeared calculated, efficient, and terrifyingly unpredictable. If a respectable merchant could be slaughtered inside his own locked home, who could possibly consider themselves safe? Only 12 days later, the nightmare returned. This time the victims were John Williamson, his wife Elizabeth, and their household servant, murdered inside another shop along Ratcliff Highway. Once again, the attacks occurred under cover of darkness. Once again, entire families were wiped out with astonishing speed. The similarities between the two crimes convinced investigators that they were hunting the same individual. Imagine living in London during those weeks. Every unfamiliar footstep outside your window after dark would sound threatening. Every knock at the door might signal death. How long before fear itself became as dangerous as the killer? Authorities launched one of the largest criminal investigations Britain had ever seen. Hundreds of witnesses were interviewed. Dock workers, sailors, labourers, and local residents found themselves questioned repeatedly. Rewards were offered. Newspapers published detailed descriptions of possible suspects, fueling both public fascination and widespread paranoia. Innocent people were accused on the basis of rumour alone. Some citizens reportedly refused to leave their homes after sunset. Others formed armed neighbourhood watches. The murderer had done more than claim lives. He had transformed one of the world's largest cities into a place ruled by suspicion. Eventually, attention focused on a sailor named John Williams. Circumstantial evidence connected him to the crimes, and he was arrested before he could stand trial. Days later, however, Williams was found dead in his prison cell, having apparently taken his own life. For many officials, the case was closed, yet not everyone was convinced. Critics questioned whether the evidence truly proved his guilt. Others wondered if his death prevented investigators from uncovering accomplices or even identifying the real killer. If Williams was innocent, then the murderer had vanished forever. If he was guilty, why choose death before revealing his motives? The silence he left behind only deepened the mystery. The uncertainty surrounding the Ratcliff Highway Murders has haunted historians ever since. Some researchers believe Williams acted alone. Others argue that the crimes were too carefully executed, suggesting more than one person may have been involved. A few have even proposed connections to organised criminal networks operating around the London docks, where smuggling, piracy, and violence were common. Yet every theory encounters unanswered questions. Why these particular victims? Why such overwhelming brutality? And why did the attacks stop as suddenly as they began? The murders left a lasting mark on British society. They exposed weaknesses in early policing and intensified demands for more organised criminal investigations, changes that would eventually contribute to the creation of modern detective work. Long before the name Jack the Ripper would terrify another generation, the Ratcliff Highway Killer demonstrated how a single unknown murderer could bring an entire city to its knees. The fog-covered streets of East London became symbols of hidden danger, where every shadow seemed capable of concealing evil. More than 2 centuries later, the lamps that once illuminated Ratcliff Highway have long since gone out, replaced by the lights of a modern city. Yet history has not erased the fear that settled over those streets in December 1811. Somewhere in the silence between documented evidence and unanswered questions remains the figure responsible for 2 of England's most chilling unsolved murder mysteries. Whether John Williams was truly the killer or merely another victim of circumstance may never be known. But every winter, when fog drifts once again across the old docklands, it is difficult not to imagine an unseen figure disappearing into the darkness, leaving behind only empty streets, locked doors, and questions that no investigation has ever fully answered. Some murders leave behind evidence, others leave behind legends. Few crimes in 19th century England blurred the line between documented history and supernatural folklore as completely as the Red Barn murder. It is a story that begins with young love, secret promises, and an isolated countryside, but ends with one of Britain's most haunting criminal investigations. Long after the trial concluded, people continued asking the same unsettling question. Was the killer exposed by careful detective work, or by a message delivered from beyond the grave? The story begins in the quiet Suffolk village of Polstead during the 1820s. Maria Martin was the daughter of a local mole catcher, while William Corder came from a more prosperous farming family. Their relationship quickly became the subject of village gossip. Maria had already endured personal tragedy and social hardship, and William possessed a reputation for charm that many believed concealed a manipulative nature. Eventually, according to their plan, the two agreed to flee together and begin a new life elsewhere. They arranged to meet at a local landmark known as the Red Barn. an old agricultural building standing alone among open fields. Maria left home believing she was about to start a new chapter. She was never seen alive again. Weeks turned into months. William sent letters claiming that he and Maria were living happily together in another town. The messages seemed reassuring enough that some family members accepted them at face value, yet others sensed that something was wrong. Maria never wrote to her parents herself. No neighbours reported seeing the couple together. Small inconsistencies began to emerge, each one insignificant on its own, but together forming an uneasy picture. Imagine receiving letters supposedly written on behalf of someone you loved, yet never hearing directly from them. At what point would hope give way to suspicion? Then came the event that transformed an ordinary missing person investigation into enduring folklore. According to the most famous version of the story, Maria's stepmother repeatedly experienced vivid dreams in which she saw Maria's body buried beneath the floor of the Red Barn. Night after night, the dreams reportedly returned with remarkable detail until she pleaded with Maria's father to search the building. Historians note that some aspects of this account were likely embellished over time, and there are differing versions of how the search was ultimately prompted. Nevertheless, the dream became inseparable from the legend. Was it simply coincidence? Intuition born from mounting suspicion? Or a story that grew larger through retelling after the body was found? When investigators searched the Red Barn, they made a grim discovery. Buried beneath the earthen floor were Maria Martin's remains. The evidence immediately shifted attention toward William Corder, who had disappeared from the area. Authorities eventually traced him to London, where he had assumed a new identity and was reportedly seeking another marriage. His arrest shocked the public. Newspapers across Britain followed every development with intense fascination, turning the investigation into one of the country's earliest media sensations. Yet even with a suspect in custody, many questions lingered. Had Corder planned the crime from the beginning, or had events spiraled beyond his control during their meeting at the barn? The trial captivated Victorian Britain. Prosecutors presented evidence suggesting that Corder had deliberately lured Maria to the Red Barn before killing her and concealing her body. The defense challenged portions of the case, but the weight of the evidence convinced the jury. William Corder was found guilty and sentenced to death. His execution drew enormous crowds, while pamphlets, stage plays, ballads, and newspaper reports spread the story throughout the country. In many ways, the Red Barn murder became one of Britain's first true crime sensations, demonstrating how public fascination with unsolved mysteries and notorious crimes was already flourishing long before modern media. Yet the folklore surrounding the case refused to fade after the trial. Visitors claimed the Red Barn became haunted by Maria's restless spirit. Reports circulated of ghostly figures appearing near the building after sunset, unexplained lights moving through the surrounding fields, and strange sounds echoing from the empty structure. Whether these stories reflected genuine belief, local tradition, or the power of suggestion is impossible to determine. Once tragedy becomes attached to a place, ordinary sights and sounds often take on extraordinary meanings. If you stood alone beside that weathered barn on a fog-covered evening, would every creak of old timber suddenly feel like something more? Today, historians generally regard the Red Barn murder as a solved homicide rather than an unsolved mystery. Yet what keeps the story alive is not uncertainty about the verdict, but the extraordinary blend of documented crime and supernatural tradition that grew around it. The alleged prophetic dreams, the lonely countryside, the isolated barn, and the lingering ghost stories transformed an ordinary criminal case into something far more enduring. It reminds us that history is shaped not only by facts preserved in court records, but also by the stories communities tell to make sense of tragedy. Somewhere between the documented investigation and the folklore that followed lies a mystery that continues to fascinate nearly 2 centuries later. And perhaps that is why the Red Barn still captures our imagination. Not because we question whether a crime occurred, but because we continue to wonder whether justice arrived through evidence alone, or whether something unseen helped lead investigators to the truth. London, 1888. The city stood at the height of the Victorian era, a place of breathtaking wealth and crushing poverty existing side by side. Horse-drawn carriages rolled past grand government buildings, while, only a few streets away, narrow alleys disappeared into darkness where gas lamps barely pierced the thick autumn fog. The East End had become a place haunted by fear, as the murders attributed to Jack the Ripper dominated newspaper headlines around the world. Yet while the public watched Whitechapel in terror, another mystery quietly unfolded only a short distance away, one so strange that it would remain unsolved for generations. It became known simply as the Whitehall Mystery, a case that asked an unsettling question. Was another killer stalking Victorian London? Or was something even darker happening beneath the city's surface? On October 2nd, 1888, labourers working near the construction site of what would eventually become the headquarters of Scotland Yard made a gruesome discovery. Hidden inside an unfinished vault beneath the building were human remains wrapped in cloth. The victim had been carefully dismembered, and significant portions of the body were missing. There was no identification, no obvious clues pointing toward the victim's identity, and almost nothing investigators could use to reconstruct the person's final hours. Imagine being one of those workers descending into the dimly lit cellar, expecting another ordinary day of construction, only to uncover evidence of a murder that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal. The timing immediately fueled speculation. London was already gripped by fear because of the Whitechapel murders, and newspapers wasted little time asking whether this horrifying discovery could somehow be connected. The similarities were enough to ignite public imagination. Both crimes involved victims whose identities remained uncertain. Both occurred within the same general period. Both reflected a level of violence that shocked Victorian society. Yet investigators also recognised important differences. The methods did not perfectly align, and evidence directly linking the Whitehall remains to the Ripper murders was never established. Was London facing 2 separate killers operating at the same time? Or was coincidence simply magnifying public fear? Police launched an intensive investigation, but from the very beginning they faced enormous obstacles. Modern forensic science did not yet exist. Detectives relied on witness interviews, physical observation, and painstaking comparison of limited evidence. The victim's identity proved especially difficult to establish because much of the body had never been recovered. Without knowing who the victim was, determining motive became nearly impossible. Every investigation begins with the same basic questions. Who was the victim? Who knew them? Why were they targeted? In this case, investigators could answer none of them. How do you solve a murder when even the identity of the person killed remains a mystery? As detectives searched for answers, another unsettling possibility emerged. The Whitehall mystery was not the first case of dismembered human remains appearing across London during the late 19th century. Historians now refer to several similar incidents collectively as the Thames Torso Murders, a series of cases in which body parts were discovered in different locations around the city over a number of years. Whether these crimes were connected remains uncertain, and experts continue to debate the evidence. Still, the pattern raises an uncomfortable question. If these murders shared a common perpetrator, could one of Victorian London's most prolific killers have been operating in the shadows while public attention remained fixed on Jack the Ripper? The newspapers seized upon every rumour. Speculation spread rapidly through London's crowded streets. Some believed the victim had been connected to organised crime operating along the docks. Others suspected political intrigue or attempts to conceal scandal involving influential individuals. More sensational publications suggested secret societies, hidden rituals, or elaborate conspiracies. Most of these claims lacked evidence, yet they reflected the atmosphere of fear gripping the city. When information is scarce, imagination often fills the void. How many innocent people found themselves suspected simply because no one possessed enough facts to separate truth from rumour? One of the most haunting aspects of the Whitehall Mystery is the anonymity of the victim. Unlike many historical murder cases where the victim's life can be reconstructed through letters, family records, and personal history, this individual remains largely unknown. No confirmed name, no family stepping forward with certainty, no complete story of the life that ended beneath the streets of London. In many ways, the victim became invisible twice, first through murder and then through history itself. It is a sobering reminder that behind every unsolved case lies not merely a puzzle, but a human life whose story was never allowed to reach its natural conclusion. More than a century later, historians continue examining surviving police records, newspaper archives, and forensic theories in hopes of uncovering new insights. Some researchers believe the Whitehall Mystery and the Thames Torso cases deserve far greater attention than they have received. Others remain cautious, noting how incomplete evidence encourages speculation beyond what history can support. The uncertainty is precisely what gives the case its enduring power. Every unanswered question invites another theory, while every missing piece of evidence reminds us how fragile historical truth can become when time erases the witnesses. Today, modern London rises above the streets where the Whitehall Mystery unfolded, its towering buildings and constant traffic concealing the shadows of the Victorian city below. Yet somewhere beneath that bustling capital lies the memory of an unidentified victim discovered only steps away from the future headquarters of the very institution tasked with solving crimes. It is a haunting irony that one of Britain's most enduring murder mysteries unfolded almost in the shadow of Scotland Yard itself. Who was the victim? Who carried out the crime? Were investigators chasing a second unknown killer while all eyes searched for Jack the Ripper? Those questions remain unanswered. And perhaps somewhere beneath the foundations of modern London, history still guards the final secrets of the Whitehall Mystery. On a cold March morning in 1873, the waters surrounding the tiny Isles of Shoals were eerily calm. Rising from the Atlantic just off the coasts of New Hampshire and Maine, these rocky islands had always felt isolated from the rest of the world. Fierce winter storms, thick sea fog, and crashing waves often cut them off for days at a time. Only a handful of fishermen and seasonal visitors called the islands home. Once darkness fell, the Atlantic became a wall separating the islands from civilization. It was here, on the lonely shores of Smuttynose Island, that one of New England's most haunting unsolved murder mysteries unfolded. A crime so chilling that even today, historians continue debating who truly wielded the axe that night. The island was home to two Norwegian immigrant women, Karen Christensen and Anita Christensen, who lived with their families in modest cottages overlooking the sea. Life was harsh but predictable. Days were spent fishing, tending homes, and preparing for the unforgiving winters that defined island life. Visitors were rare, and strangers seldom appeared without being noticed. That isolation made the events of March 5th all the more unsettling. Whoever committed the murders had arrived on an island where everyone knew everyone else. There would be no crowded city streets in which to disappear, only open ocean in every direction. So why would anyone choose such a remote place to commit such a brutal crime? As darkness settled over Smuttynose Island that evening, a violent attack shattered the quiet. Karen Christensen and Anetha Christensen were assaulted inside one of the island homes. Karen died from her injuries. Anetha was also killed. A third woman, Maren Hontvet, managed to escape into the darkness. Terrified and barefoot, she fled across the frozen rocks and hid until she believed the attacker had gone. Imagine the terror of standing alone on a tiny island in the middle of the Atlantic, surrounded by darkness, uncertain whether the killer was still searching nearby. With nowhere to run except toward the sea itself, how long would every gust of wind sound like approaching footsteps? When help finally arrived, investigators faced an extraordinary challenge. The crime scene offered few obvious clues, and severe weather had already begun erasing evidence. Unlike murders committed in crowded towns, there were almost no independent witnesses to question. Boats travelling between the mainland and the islands were limited, making every arrival and departure significant. Yet the isolation that should have narrowed the suspect list instead complicated the investigation. Had the killer come from the mainland? Was the murderer already familiar with the victims? Or had someone on the island concealed the truth out of fear or loyalty? Attention soon turned toward a Norwegian fisherman named Louis Wagner, who had previously worked with members of the island community. Prosecutors argued that Wagner had travelled to Smuttynose, intending to rob the household, and that the murders occurred during the course of the crime. Much of the case relied upon circumstantial evidence, testimony regarding his movements, and items allegedly connected to the murders. Wagner maintained his innocence, insisting he had not committed the crimes. The evidence convinced a jury, and he was ultimately convicted and executed. Yet from the beginning, questions lingered. Did investigators truly identify the right man, or had the pressure to solve a shocking double homicide influenced the outcome? Historians continue debating aspects of the case more than 150 years later. Some believe the prosecution presented sufficient evidence to justify the conviction. Others argue that important uncertainties remain regarding witness testimony, timelines, and physical evidence. Unlike modern criminal investigations, 19th century detectives lacked forensic science capable of providing definitive answers. There was no DNA analysis, no fingerprint database, and no surveillance to reconstruct movements. Much depended upon memory, interpretation, and circumstance. Could an innocent man have been condemned because investigators simply lacked better tools? Or did the real killer indeed face justice, while lingering doubts are merely the product of history's distance? The atmosphere surrounding Smuttynose Island has only deepened the mystery over time. The cottages still face the restless Atlantic. Dense fog continues to roll across the rocky shoreline without warning. Visitors often remark on the profound silence that settles over the island once the last ferry departs. Local folklore speaks of unexplained sounds carried on the wind and lingering sadness surrounding the old homesteads. Whether these stories reflect genuine belief or the emotional weight of history, they remind us how places touched by tragedy often acquire lives of their own. Does the landscape preserve memory, or do we simply project our fears onto lonely places where unimaginable events once occurred? Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Smuttynose Island murders is the profound vulnerability created by isolation. In a city, danger can disappear into crowds. On a remote island, there is nowhere to hide and nowhere to escape except across open water. Every unfamiliar boat becomes suspicious. Every stranger is remembered. Every silence carries meaning. The Atlantic itself becomes both protector and prison. It is difficult not to wonder what those final hours felt like for the people living there, knowing that help was separated from them by miles of freezing ocean. Today, Smuttynose Island remains peaceful, its rocky shoreline attracting visitors interested in New England's maritime history rather than its darkest chapter. Yet beneath the beauty of the windswept coast lingers one of America's most enduring historical murder mysteries. Whether Louis Wagner was truly guilty, or whether unanswered questions still conceal part of the truth, the island refuses to surrender every secret. As evening fog drifts once again across the Atlantic and the last light fades beyond the horizon, one question still echoes through the lonely silence. On that isolated island in 1873, did justice truly prevail? Or did the sea quietly carry away the final pieces of a mystery that can never be solved?